find myself arguing with believers almost every day, and it's rare that they ever ask me a sincere question, something they actually want the answer to. Usually they only ask me things that they hope I don't have an answer to, as if that means something. But I got a sincere question today, and it's of the sort that I want to share with a wider audience. Someone asked me, could I expand on how I would interpret our current classification of kinds? Since the word kind effectively means that anything that's a horse will always remain a horse and can never be improved further than being a horse, at least without intentional manipulation of the genes, which would classically be referred to as a chimera. I asked them to explain what a created kind is and how to distinguish that from evolved taxa, but they didn't know what I meant. And it's important to this topic. So, yeah, I will happily clarify and correct that no. First of all, a chimera would mean an organism with multiple sets of DNA or DNA from different sources. Modifying existing DNA would not be a chimera. More importantly, the word kind does not now and never did mean that a horse will always be a horse. This is yet another creationist distortion, one of my favorites because it is so dishonest. If a horse ever produced something that was not a horse, that would actually violate two of the natural laws of evolution. Evolution is defined as descent with inherent modification, specifically referring to changing allele frequencies and reproductive populations over many generations. Thus, every new taxa that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were and still belongs to every parent clade that they did. You can't grow out of your ancestry. Thus, horses will always be horses, even if they evolve into something that seems different from how horses are now. For example, the root of all horses 55 million years ago was apparently only about the size of a house cat with 4 toes on the front foot and 3 on the back. The name we give to the species may change, but that's the only thing that does. The genetic lineage remains intact. And this is the earliest known perissodactyl. Modern horses are still perissodactyls. The ancestors of perissodactyls collectively, and this one specifically, were ungulates. So this is an ungulate too, and so are modern horses still. What creationists mean by one thing changing into another fundamentally different thing, if I can quote Kent Hovind from Creation Science Evangelism and Dinosaur Adventureland, he wants something like elephants giving birth to pine trees or corn stalks producing hamsters, something where the offspring is so different that it's not even related to its parents. Obviously, that's not the case. That is a deliberate straw man to set up to try to prevent the creationist from understanding reality by hampering the question so badly that it cannot be intelligently answered. But I'm going to answer yours. Creationists, determined to deny evident and demonstrable reality in favor of their favorite folklore, insist on rejecting evolutionary phylogenies, no matter how well understood or supported. So they came up with a number of contradictory excuses, pleading for created kinds instead, pretending as if their God used an incantation to conjure different kinds of life separately, which I'm sure sounded fine before anyone knew anything about taxonomy. But now that we do, we need to know, what do you mean by a kind? Carolus Linnaeus devised the first taxonomic system in 1735, and that immediately sent shockwaves through the scientific and religious community. And he was shocked himself, too, when his system did not reveal separate boxes of created kinds like he expected, being a Christian and a creationist. Instead, it resolved a branching pattern of a family tree, with myriad daughter groups descending from parental sets, themselves siblings of other subsets of the same ancestral lineage. How could that be? He realized that such a thing was impossible unless new species could be derived. And when he realized this, he had to reject his own conclusion because he believed that every species was created by God, separately, but all at the same time, or at least on the same day or in the same week. Now, back then, people already knew how to derive new breeds or cultivars by selective breeding, but that requires that they be able to breed. But the biological species concept holds that two different species might be able to produce infertile hybrids if they're in the same genus, but otherwise, two different species either cannot interbreed at all, or they will not under normal conditions, only in captivity or when there are no other options, and when the species are under duress, perhaps. And even then, you'll usually only get an infertile hybrid if both species are in the same genus. Now, before they invented the word species and the biological species concept, they already had the Bible's description of what a kind is. when two animals interbreed and bring forth fertile offspring after their kind. So at that point, biological species and biblical kinds meant the same thing, and to some creationists, they still do mean the same thing. Here's creationist Philip Johnson with the Discovery Institute unwittingly admitting that during a debate.
The theory is perfectly valid at that level of minor changes that do not produce new kinds of organisms and that, above all, do not add to the genetic information. Breeders are able to produce change only within boundaries. Even those dogs are all members of a single biological species, which are chemically interfertile. We don't get dogs getting bigger and bigger indefinitely, as big as elephants or whales, much less changing into elephants or whales. And the claim that if selective breeding hasn't produced the kind of macro changes, the kinds of new forms of life, new complex organs that are needed, that's only because there hasn't been enough time.
So Carolus Linnaeus and the people of his day said that we've seen new breeds come along, but you couldn't have a new species without a special act of creation by God. But then a century later, Darwin chimed in, explaining the origin of species by means of natural selection. So now we had a mechanism by which it could happen. But for another century or so, believers raged on that evolution could only occur within definite limits, only to subtle variants within their kind, which they consistently associated with species. A microevolution is variation within a single species, and macroevolution is variation between species, including the origination of species, the emergence of new species, speciation. That would be macroevolution. Now, even in my own lifetime, illiterate believers still argued that no one had ever seen the evolution of a new species. So microevolution is fine, but macroevolution never been confirmed. But then they started figuring out genetics and mutations and how the livestock and agricultural industries have actually been relying increasingly on evolutionary principles. Just in the last 30 years or so, even some diehard young Earth creationists began to admit that speciation has actually been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field. Here is young Earth creationist Kent Hovind admitting that while in a debate with me.
Variations within species and even creation of new species is possible and has been observed. That is science and is no problem for Bible believers who say that God clearly said they will always bring forth after their kind.
At some point, even these diehard believers realize that if you divide one population into two or more and keep them separate long enough, unique mutations will continue to accrue in one group that are not shared by the other, and vice versa. So they sort of grow apart, becoming increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins. And these differences continue to build up, diminishing the possibility of interfertility, leading to speciation. In other words, it becomes harder and harder to interbreed if they ever had the opportunity. Roll the dice, you get a lower and lower chance until they don't produce anything viable at all. So now we have two groups having evolved from a common ancestor, and maybe they're both the same genus or family, but they're no longer the same species because they're no longer able to interbreed. If creationists accept that speciation happens, then they also have to accept that at some point, the African painted dog and the Asian raccoon dog and the South American bush dog can no longer interbreed with the Australian dingo. They can no longer bring forth after their kind, which ought to mean that they're not the same kind anymore. But creationists cannot admit that because faith means never admitting when you're always wrong. So instead of conceding that any aspect of macroevolution had actually been observed or confirmed, they simply moved the goalpost by redefining macroevolution as molecules to men or as Darwinism, and redefining kind so that it is no longer synonymous with species.
Probably the kind indicates somewhere around the family or genus level. Everything above that is speculation.
Okay, if we're switching to this description, there's a whole nother set of problems. First of all, it means that they're ignoring the description the Bible gives. And to be fair, the first problem with any position that is based on the Bible is usually the Bible itself, contradicting itself, undoing what, or contesting what it already said elsewhere. And remember that a created kind is supposed to be where God poofed all these different species into being separately, like all on the fifth day of creation, if we're talking about birds. So God creates all kinds of birds. And the first problem with that is that why isn't it the bird kind? Why are there different kinds of birds? Why isn't bird a kind? But Birds should all be one kind. The fossil record shows a monophyletic origin of all birds descending from a common ancestor. But that's not the only problem, because Deuteronomy 14 says there are different kinds of falcons, different kinds of ravens, different kinds of hawks, and different kinds of herons. So we're talking about raven as a genus, so different species within a genus. And hawk, again, is a different species within a genus. So we're back to the species level, just like we started out with. So they're contesting the Bible on 2 points now. Now, have you noticed how often biblical literalists will start off by saying that they take every word of the Bible as absolutely infallible, literal truth until they don't, because it says something they don't like, or it says something they can't use, or that contradicts them? Then their literalism falls away and they take it metaphorically, which is fine because that's the only way one can glean any interpretation of truth out of the Bible anyway. Another problem is that if you're going to accept macroevolution without calling it that, if you're going to accept speciation at the species level and above to the genus or family level, and Ken Ham says it can even go up to the level of taxonomic order, whatever he needs it to be at the moment, in order to deny the macroevolution that he clearly embraces by definition. Now we have another interpretation of kind, such that it's not limited to nor synonymous with species, but it's still a taxonomic clade with a monophyletic origin, meaning descent with modification, so that many species could all belong to the same clade of either beasts or birds or whatever. Thus, theistic evolutionists, the folks that believe that God used evolution as his creative tool over millions of years, would cite where God said to let the earth bring forth the living creature after its kind, and every winged fowl after their kind. And they'll say that that fits with their belief, which it does, because that follows a monophyletic phylogeny, until they remember Peruvian dinosaurs. And then they have to wonder, well, what are they? Are they beasts? Are they birds? Which kind are they? And that's a problem, isn't it? So at some point, theistic evolutionists, old Earth creationists, and even young Earth creationists do accept that some level of taxonomy is real and accurate.
Carolus Linnaeus is famous for his work in taxonomy, the science of identifying, naming, and classifying organisms, plants, bacteria, etc. He was born in 1707. Linnaeus' thoughts on evolution are very different from the modern-day theories. He believed that species were immutable, means species can't change. Now, he was wrong about this. He would say if there are 30 different kinds of sparrows, then God made 30 different kinds of sparrows. He went overboard in that regard. God might have made 2 sparrows, and Noah might have had 2 sparrows on the ark, and they've now diversified to 30 varieties of sparrows.
Notice how Kent Hovind distinguishes kinds from varieties, especially when he brings up Noah's Ark, because there again, Noah was supposed to take aboard every kind of animal that had the breath of life. And creationists understand that there are now 181 different species of sparrows. Why would God build 181 nearly identical birds, especially when we have molecular evidence that all these New World sparrows and the Old World sparrows both derive from a common ancestral source? And that you could get 181 different species of sparrows if you just had the one original species and let that one become 2 species to become 4, become 8 and 16 and so forth. You could get all of that through evolution. So they finally realized that, well, maybe God didn't do all of that. Maybe Noah wouldn't have had to have all of those on the ark, because 181 pairs of sparrows wouldn't be a problem for the ark until you realize that there are some 10,000 species of birds in general. And then you have to figure in over 700 species of dinosaurs, many of which are quite large. And how are you fitting all those on the ark? Along with more than 10,000 species of modern reptiles and more than 5,000 species of modern mammals. And those 32,000 breeding pairs amount to 64,000 individuals just among the extant, without even looking at the rest of the fossil forms, which outweigh everything else alive today. So creationists realize there's no possible way you're putting every living species on this boat, much less everything that ever lived, since they try to compress the whole of paleohistory into a single millennium. So they realized, what if we used evolution and said that all the thousands of modern variants were all derived from a relatively few kinds?
You didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the ark as people think. You wouldn't need all the species of dogs, just 2. Not all the species of cats, just 2.
So the young Earth creationists say that they don't believe in macroevolution, yet they evoke a sort of super accelerated, hyper caffeinated, turbocharged, and Viagravated electro-mega evolution on steroids in order to produce all the variety we have today from the paltry amount that would fit onto that imaginary boat on a fantasy flood that we know for certain did not really happen 4,400 years ago. But make-believers going to pretend no matter what the truth is. The important takeaway here is that even young Earth creationists accept some degree of taxonomy as being completely valid and justified, both at the macro and micro ranges, at the level of genus and family, and even higher, depending on the whim of whoever you ask. And since they have so much trouble explaining this, I suggest that they show me 3 different kinds of animals that science would consider closely related, so we can tell what makes a different kind. I've asked that before, and the answer I got was mammal, amphibian, and reptile, which means that there would only be 3 breeding pairs on the ark. I suppose you could throw in birds, and then we'd have 4 breeding pairs on the ark. But the thing is that the creationists who suggested that wouldn't go with that their own answer. So let's get a little closer related, please. How about if you show me 4 individuals, 2 from the same kind and 2 from a couple of different kinds, so that 3 kinds are represented by those 4 individuals. And don't forget to explain the reason why, how to know this, because that's the most important thing. And again, no takers, because they know there's no such thing as a kind, that it's all pretend. So when I ask for the facts and evidence to justify this absurd assertion, I'm told that even a 5-year-old can tell you they're the same kind, or that these are obviously different, depending on whether they want to believe they're the same or not. But it's just their personal opinion. That's all they got. They don't have a reason, no way to know. And besides, I've tried inquiring of 5-year-olds. They're not much smarter than the creationists themselves, so they don't know the answer. What is the answer, really? If evolution from common ancestry is not entirely true, and some flavor of special creation of as yet unidentified kinds is true, then there would be some surface levels in a cladogram where you would both expect and accept an actual evolutionary ancestry. But there must also be a cutoff point, an original node that is not part of a parent clade, where there are no nearly identical sister taxa, and this represents what God originally created, which was also preserved aboard Noah's mythical ark. So let's take a walk back through our taxonomic trees, looking carefully to see how much of this is attributable to macroevolution before we find a moment of micro creation. But again, there are no takers, because they know we'll never get there, because they're lying in defense of the faith, and they know it. They know it, I know it, they know that I know that they know it. Understand that if there was any validity to creationism whatsoever, which we already know that there isn't, or if there was some critical flaw in the overall theory of evolution from common ancestry, then that flaw must be found here in taxonomy, or it simply can't be anywhere else. You have to be able to show how to distinguish what is biologically related from what is magically created. And if you can't, then you can't even make a case, and we have nothing to talk about.